The title of my presentation is Ethical Reasoning and Moral Foundations Among Engineering Students in China. This presentation will describe a study carried out last year. The ethical reasoning and ethical intuitions and dispositions of engineering students were assessed at the beginning and end of a course on engineering ethics at a university in Shanghai, China. Initial results indicate, first, that previous differences in ethical reasoning between native and non-native English-speaking students are probably better explained by cultural than language differences. 2, engineering ethics education increases ethical reasoning. And 3, ethical reasoning is positively associated with care and negatively associated with loyalty. Previous research has examined the effects of engineering ethics education on ethical reasoning using participants from mostly WEIRD. This is an acronym standing for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, Democratic Cultures. However, a growing body of work has called into question the extent to which, first, ethical judgments and behaviors result primarily or exclusively from ethical reasoning, and second, whether WEIRD participants are representative on a number of psychological dimensions. The study described here explored the nature of and relations between ethical reasoning and ethical intuitions and dispositions among engineering students in China. So not only ethical reasoning, but also ethical intuitions and dispositions and their relationship to ethical reasoning, and then not among WEIRD participants, but among engineering students in China. To assess ethical reasoning, the Engineering and Sciences Issues Test was used. This was developed by Jason Bornstein and colleagues at Georgia Tech University. It's based on a neo-Kohlbergian understanding of ethics. On this understanding, ethical judgments result from ethical reasoning using different schema. Schema are ways of conceiving and judging issues of right and wrong. There are 3 main schema: the pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. When people make judgments using the pre-conventional schema, they make judgments about right and wrong, depending primarily on self-interest. When they use the conventional schema, those judgments are based on social rules, and when they use the post-conventional schema, those decisions are based on ideal principles. This instrument uses P-scores and N2 scores to assess ethical reasoning. P-scores are the amount of post-conventional reasoning used, or ethical reasoning using the post-conventional schema, whereas N2 scores are the amount of post-conventional reasoning relative to pre-conventional reasoning. So more post-conventional reasoning and less pre-conventional reasoning. Research by Bornstein's team, as well as another led by Heather Cannery, found that non-native English-speaking students received lower scores, P and N2 scores, and that their scores were less affected by ethics education. However, it's unclear if this effect results from language or culture. For instance, that students fail to adequately comprehend and respond to ESIT items and ethics education because of lower levels of English language proficiency. This would be a language explanation, or arrive at ethical decisions in a manner different from that informing the neo-Kohlbergian perspective on which the ESIT is based. So this would be a cultural explanation. In general, both teams found that students received higher N2 scores after completing a course on engineering ethics specifically, but not courses on technology and society or technology and values. Okay, to assess ethical intuitions, dispositions, the Moral Foundations Questionnaire was used. This was developed by Jonathan Haidt and Associates and is an instrument associated with Moral Foundations theory. According to Moral Foundations theory, ethical judgments result from intuitions. Intuitions are closer in nature to emotions than reason, and they are associated with at least 5 different moral foundations. Moral foundations, similar to schema, are different ways of conceiving normativity. These 5 consist in care, fairness, loyalty, authority, and sanctity. Care and fairness are sometimes referred to as the individuating foundations, whereas loyalty, authority, and sanctity are referred to as the binding foundations. Care and fairness ensure the continued protection, survival of the individual, whereas loyalty, authority, and sanctity protect and ensure the continued existence of groups. This instrument uses relevance scores and agreement scores. Relevance scores ask, when you decide whether something is right or wrong, to what extent are the following considerations relevant to your thinking? And agreement scores, read the following sentences and indicate your agreement or disagreement. The Moral Foundations Questionnaire has been translated into more than 35 languages and administered in over 25 countries. So it's been used cross-culturally and internationally. Previous research has found that participants who identify as politically conservative, as well as those from East Asian countries, tend to emphasize all the foundations, whereas participants who identify as politically liberal and those from Western countries tend to emphasize the individuating and de-emphasize the binding foundations. Okay, to date, only 2 studies have explored the relation between moral foundations and ethical reasoning as conceived in the neo-Kohlbergian framework on which the ESIT is based. Gillen Barrell and Jennifer Wright found that pre-conventional and conventional reasoning were positively related to the loyalty and authority foundations, respectively, and that prioritizing the individuating over the binding foundations was predictive of post-conventional reasoning. Rebecca Glover and colleagues reported that the binding foundations positively predicted conventional reasoning and negatively predicted P and N2 scores. Therefore, on the basis of these previous findings, the following hypotheses were posed. 1. Students with previous ethics education would receive higher P and N2 scores on the ESIT. Students in this sample would receive lower P and N2 scores on the ESIT than those in previous studies, since the participants in this sample were non-native English-speaking students. 3. Students in this study would receive higher N2 scores after completing a 1-semester-long 2-credit-hour course in engineering ethics. Since this course curriculum focused on engineering ethics specifically, no prediction was made about the effects of ethics education on Moral Foundations Questionnaire scores, although this was an area of interest as well. And then 4 higher mean scores on the individuating foundations and lower mean scores on the binding foundations would be associated with higher P and N2 scores on the ESIT. Here's some information about the participants in the study. Since there's not a lot of time, I'm not going to talk about this in depth. Here's a bit of information about the materials and procedure. Again, I'm not going to get into this too much because time is limited. Okay, the results. 3 of the 4 hypotheses were partially supported. So first, students with previous ethics education did not receive higher P and N2 scores on the ESIT. So this hypothesis that we had posed was not supported. We didn't find any difference on P and N2 scores on the basis of previous ethics education. Hypothesis 2 about the relation between native language and P and N2 scores was partially supported, since students in this sample received significantly lower N2 scores pre and post course, but not lower P scores. And so you can see these results in Table 3, as well as the tests that we carried out to determine that. Hypothesis 3 about the effects of ethics education on N2 scores was supported, since students received significantly higher N2 scores post-course. So you can see that. Mean scores on the care and loyalty foundations were significantly higher post-course, indicating these took on increased importance or significance at the end of the semester. Those results are shown here in Table 4. Hypothesis 4 about the relations between moral foundations and P and N2 scores was partially supported. The CARE Foundation was significantly correlated with P scores at the 10% level, and the Loyalty Foundation was negatively correlated with N2 scores at a level that approached significance. You can find the results of the correlations in Table 5 over here. Okay, some discussion of these results. No differences found in ESIT scores based on demographic information lend support to the use of the ESIT as a valid instrument, showing it's not biased, for instance, against females. It's not biased, for instance, against different political orientations. The ESIT is capable of discerning gains made in ethical reasoning, so students took it at the end of the semester as well as at the beginning of the semester, and they scored higher at the end of the semester, showing that it's capable of discerning gains made through ethics education. Study results seem to support cultural rather than linguistic explanations of ESIT differences. Qualitatively, participants in this study made pre- to post-course gains similar to those of native English speakers in Bornstein and colleagues' study. Both samples beginning and ending with similar p-scores but ending with higher N2 scores, indicative of decreased pre-conventional reasoning. If it were the case that previous study results were a result of this language effect, then we wouldn't expect to see qualitative gains. In this study, they're similar to those of Bornstein. It would just be the case that students would begin with lower scores across the board, and then they would end with lower scores across the board. But we didn't find that. This study provides further evidence for the positive effects of specialized engineering ethics education. One of the things to note about the fact that P scores didn't change, but N2 scores did change, is that this type of education seems to reduce reasoning based on self-interest rather than increase ethical reasoning as such. So just as a reminder, P scores are indicative of the amount of post-conventional reasoning being used, whereas N2 scores are an indication of the amount of that relative to an absence of pre-conventional reasoning. The fact that N2 scores went up but P scores didn't basically shows that there's less pre-conventional reasoning or reasoning on the basis of self-interest, not necessarily that post-conventional reasoning goes up, but pre-conventional reasoning and reasoning on the basis of self-interest alone goes down. So that's an interesting finding that we would certainly like to explore more. Okay, so conclusion, future work. First, the study provides evidence, one, for the effectiveness of using the ESIT outside the United States and among non-native English-speaking participants. 2, that engineering ethics education can increase ethical reasoning abilities. And 3, that ethical reasoning is related to moral dispositions, although in our study only weakly. Part of the reason for this and what we plan to do in future work is get a bigger sample size. So again, the P scores were not particularly significant. This could be a result of just having such a small sample size. We didn't look at effect sizes either, but certainly we'd like to do that going forward. Interestingly, also, although ethics education resulted in a greater concern with loyalty, loyalty was negatively related to N2 scores. And then also in that correlation table I showed you before, a lot of the MFQ items were associated in unexpected ways, but it was kind of beyond the scope of this study to address that. And there's not a lot of time for this presentation, so I don't want to talk about it now, but I'm certainly happy to talk about that more during the Q&A. Okay, thanks a lot for your time and attention.